Hi, and welcome to the next CIPD London Organisation Development and Design session. So these are sessions that we run quarterly, and each quarter we invite a really interesting and engaging OD practitioner or expert in to talk about their practice or things that they're working on at any one time. And we've been delighted with just the quality of the guests. So I sent a speculative email out to Martin Saville from Mayvin. Mayvin are a real kind of cutting edge organisation development consultancy. We actually had them, and in particular Martin, come and join us for an event that we ran for HR business partners, and he talks about embodied leadership, and we had just really great feedback on it as well. So we asked Martin if he'd be happy to come in and be our guest for this particular session that we're running, and we talked through some various ideas, and Martin has come back with a really provocative session to really sort of stimulate people's thinking, and that's from VUCA to BANI. So VUCA, obviously, is it volatile,
uncertain, chaotic, ambiguous,
absolutely complex. to BANI, and so this is really about how to rethink your OD practice in a complex world. So the event is running on the 27th of June. These are lunchtime events, so they run from 12 p.m. to 1:15. So they're really sort of short, sharp introduction sessions just to introduce the concepts, give you some basic tools, and to discuss it with fellow OD practitioners. So whether you're an internal practitioner or an external practitioner, it's a great space. And what we do with each of these sessions, obviously we've had people like Gwen Sterling-Wilkie coming in and talking about omni working. We've had Steve Hearson come in and talking about being at the center of change. And each of these sessions we record an interview which lasts around about 20-25 minutes, just to go a bit of a deeper, give you a bit of an appetizer if you can't make the session itself, and just to introduce some of the concepts as well. So I'm hugely appreciative of Martin's time, and Martin's agreed to sit down with me for half an hour or so. So Martin, we're really delighted to have you join us for the session. For those that don't know, you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that Mayvin does.
Sure, thank you, Garin. Really pleasure to be here. So yeah, Martin Saville, I'm managing director of a consultancy that specialises in OD&D, organisation development and design, one of the founders of it. And I guess these days I sort of split my time between that managing director role and being an OD practitioner. And a lot of the OD work that I do is with HR and change and OD people, looking at how they develop their practice, how they build effective teams, OD capability. So that's me. And Mayvin as a business, I guess our real sort of focus and love is around capability building. So we're a consultancy, but no matter what we're doing with our clients, there's always a dimension which is about learning and capability building. And in fact, we run a master's in people and OD as well.
Yeah, fascinating. It's interesting because obviously I'm an OD consultant. I'm out in the field. I hear lots of kind of things that Mayvin are doing. It's often really innovative. And having studied my master's in OD myself, I was really interested to hear. And what's the master's program that you've launched recently? Like, who's it positioned for, and what kind of things do you actually look to cover in the master's?
Yeah, well, thank you. So it launched last year. So we're just in the second year of it now. 11 fantastic participants working their way through. It's a master's in people and organisation development, and it's accredited by our partner at the University of Chichester, which is a really kind of OD friendly university. The business school there is they're one of us, is how I think about it. And in a way, it's our contribution to the field of OD practice. It's something that matters hugely to us. A couple of sort of distinguishing sort of aspects of it. I mean, one is that it's a hop on, hop off masters, so you can do a year at a time and bank your credits. And in fact, you can do the modules, or at least the years, in any order you want. So you can go for what interests you first. It's also practice based, so there's a real focus on developing your practice as an OD person, and that's that's something that we might find ourselves talking about a bit more in the context of the VUCA BANI conversation too.
Brilliant, thanks, and such a good introduction as well. So obviously, from VUCA to BANI, rethinking your OD practice in a complex world. So what was the inspiration behind this? What have you noticed that sort of changed in the operating environment that's required a change in thinking and a change in approach?
Yeah. So, I mean, this idea of VUCA, which I think developed in the US military, I think probably 40 or 50 years ago, although I think as OD people, we were starting to use the term perhaps in the 2000s, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, an attempt to sort of describe uh, the world in which we find ourselves. And at the time, people were saying, I think quite rightly, look, organizational life less and less stable, less and less predictable, mathematically complex. So more like weather systems than car engines, if you like, in terms of predictability and in terms of how we can make sense of them. And it was a kind of a challenge to a traditional set of tools that I suppose originated from the world of project management. And the thing I always say about project management, the CE in print stands for controlled environment. And the challenge was effectively that organizational life is anything but a controlled environment. Arguably, it always has been, but more and more so. And so we need a different set of tools to respond. I think our view has always been that these are different lenses on organizational life. Actually, it's not that there's no value in a kind of a project management orientation, but that leads you to look at the world in one way and make sense of it in one way, and therefore bring a certain set of tools to the hammer everything's a nail. And here was an alternative. And the challenge with that way of working was that kind of complexity orientated way of working was that people said, yes, it makes sense to us that this is how the world is, but actually, how am I supposed to operate? How am I supposed to practice? How am I supposed to talk about it in a way that makes sense to my internal stakeholders, to my clients, to people who are expecting clarity and certainty, and so on. Yeah, that was very much the kind of the debate that we were in, and a lot of very clever people have developed different tools and ideas, and we've pulled together our own particular approach to working skillfully with complexity. We often talk about wearing the clothes sometimes of more traditional modes of change, but actually inside of that, actually operating in a slightly more radical way. The BANI thing, it stands for brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And it's a term that was coined by a guy in America called Jaime Cascio. I think that's the correct pronunciation. An American sort of thinker, sort of futurologist, who wrote this article a few years ago, where he was sort of saying, VUCA doesn't really cut it anymore. It's sort of, it's even more now. The world is more apocalyptic. Climate. Populist politics, the things that we've been seeing in the States with George Floyd, these kinds of cataclysmic events that are sort of washing over us require for some kind of different response. And we only need to look over here in the UK, the last 5 years, Brexit, just over 5 years now, of course, since the referendum, COVID, that's the world in which we find ourselves. And so I suppose the question is, what does that mean for us as OD people? And so the proposition that we're putting forward, which is Mayvin's attempt at a response. There's no sort of claim that this is the response, and it's certainly not intended to throw out everything that's gone before, but rather sort of build and add to it. But it is a sort of a sense of, in a world like that, really all we can fall back on is our ability to reflect and learn. That's the proposition, and that what we can really control, if you like, is how we show up in that, and how we do what we do. And we're very sort of taken with this this notion of practice in that context. What we started to sort of work on with them was a sort of a sense of, well, actually, okay, there isn't time to go and design programs and OD interventions in the traditional sense, but actually, you're doing stuff, hour by hour, you're doing stuff, and moment by moment, there are opportunities, little micro moments to learn close to the grain of the work, to notice, to reflect, to catch ourselves doing things right and do more of them, to catch ourselves doing things that aren't working and change them.
Fascinating. There's so many things you've talked about there I'd love to unpack. I guess one of the things my attention's drawn to in the BANI world is the brittle piece. What does that mean, and what does it look like in practice? But I guess some of the things I've just been thinking about there is you talk about the development of your practice, which is so important. And obviously, one of the things they talk about is the expert is comfortable with not knowing and wondering how to respond. So I guess your provocation really is to do something counterintuitive in a very turbulent moment, which is particularly when we've got a bias for action, is to actually slow down and reflect, which is it's not necessarily something that organizations are very good at. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes to all those points. It's, I mean, the brittle thing, first of all. I mean, I suppose the point about that Cashier's making is this sense of, brittle things actually, they're very breakable. And of course, the more anxious we get, the more pressure we're under. If we don't have practices for looking after ourselves and making sense of what happens, the more likely we are to sort of snap, if you like. And so there's a resilience conversation, but then think about that at the kind of organizational life sessions. Well, organizations can get brittle as well. Organizations can break, and if that's the world in which we find ourselves, then as OD people, who are interested in organizational health and individuals' health, the response is, well, what can we do to help, really? I mean, I think OD is ultimately about trying to find a way to help, and often what OD people are doing is giving messages to organizations or inviting them to see things that aren't foregrounded for them, aren't figural for them, or maybe aren't even visible to them, because they're looking. I use the metaphor of, I'm looking out my window over there at a tree, and when I'm looking at the tree, I don't see the glass in between. So OD people's, opportunity is sometimes to say to people, look, here's this thing called glass, and actually, if we could look and think about that, maybe other options would open about. So often OD people are doing sort of the opposite, acting paradoxically and counterintuitively. And of course, the micro skill, and this is where the practice piece comes in, is how do I do that in a way that people will stop and think and listen and go, oh, rather than throw me out of the room, because actually
It's too woo-woo.
you don't understand, you have no idea what my world is like. Who are you to tell me to slow down? Did you and of course, there's a skill in that. And so I suppose part of the practice point here is that, one of the ideas around practice is that the way we do one thing is the way we do everything. We show up. So there's this nice idea that comes from the embodied world of, the metaphor is of the cart, so I think it's a Chinese metaphor, I'm told, where one wheel of the cart is the thing we're doing, whatever that is. So parenthood, playing tennis, ping pong, OD practice, leading, cooking, arranging flowers, making tea. That's that, you've got that wheel of the cart, the thing that we're doing. And then the other half, on the other wheel is the self that we are, that shows up. And we can almost start to see whatever it is that we're doing as an opportunity to cultivate the self. So that's the first idea, is around practice, is that actually, how I do one thing is how I do everything. I mean, if I give you an example from my life, under pressure, my tendency is always want to just want to stop and think, want to step back and stop and think. And, you know, that shows up in my role as a leader, or my role as a parent, or you know, when I'm trying to do something, you know, I don't play tennis, but you know, when I'm just trying to do practical things, you know, if I'm trying to learn something and have a go, if it goes wrong, I'll always step back. So that aspect of me is always there.
That's so
And
important, isn't it? Is it kind of sort of building on the thing that's often discussed, like sort of self as instrument, sort of really understanding who you
yeah,
are and what you bring? Yeah.
yeah, it's absolutely in that sort of space. So the self that we are, yeah, absolutely shows up. So what that then, you know, gives us an opportunity to do, if we're interested in that, is to start thinking about, well, how do I cultivate that self? How do I develop that self? So you know, in my case, in that kind of example, you know, it's kind of around, well, when does that serve me and when does that not serve me? And actually, when are the moments where I need to actually learn to just step in a bit more, and not have to stop and think about it, and not know, you know, and actually that could put me on my edge a bit. And where are the places in terms of things that I'm doing, you know, that wheel of the cart, where I could go away and practice that and develop that. And the way we translate all of that idea into a kind of an OD practitioner conversation, you know, an OD capability building conversation, is by inviting people to think about their OD practice, think about their use of self, their self as instrument, who they are, what they're noticing, what they're oversensitive to, what they're not, how they're shaped, all of that stuff. And what that means in terms of how they show up as a practitioner, but then to try and actually ground that in something that they're trying to actually do with the other wheel of the cart. So the way we do that is we invite people, for example, on our master's programs, to frame a question which begins with the stem, how can I? And the idea of that is that I'm in there. You know, how can I? You know, it's not an abstract conceptual idea. It has to be then something you're doing in the world. So, you know, how can I engage differently with a senior team that's under pressure and doesn't have time to learn, and is itself anxious and brittle? And in order to do that well and effectively, what's the piece for me that's developmental there? You know, maybe it's about having difficult conversations with people that are more powerful than I am and telling them the unvarnished truth. And why is that tricky for me? And what do I need to learn? And where can I practice that?
It's so fascinating, isn't it? And I think probably the thing that the a lot of people going into the OD profession don't always understand or anticipate is just the sheer amount of time you have to think about yourself. And sometimes it can be quite deeply uncomfortable, can't it? As you start to really sort of deconstruct yourself. Who am I? What do I bring? What are my habits? You know, where
Yeah.
do I find my security and my comfort as well? But it's a rite of passage to becoming an effective OD practitioner, isn't it?
I think it is. And I mean, it's both and, isn't it? Because, you know, it's doing that and doing that work and then going off and doing things in the world. So it's not just you disappearing into your own
Navel gazing.
bubble. Yeah. And so yeah, but you can't short circuit it. You have to do your own work. I'm really with you there. And part of that's about knowing how I show up and using myself skillfully. But
Mm,
part of that is about knowing when you respond to a particular situation, when you notice, when you have a particular interpretation and point of view that will then inform what you do, knowing what's your stuff in
mm,
that and knowing what's not, you know. And if you haven't done your work, you get a particular reaction. And of course, you know, we're you know, OD is a world of socially constructed truths, you know, where actually my perspective matters. You know, that's the mindset of an OD practitioner, rather than just it being about objective truths. But as soon as we're going to be in that, it's like, well, how can I be critical about my subjectivity? You know, how can I trust it? It's not just because I think it and I feel it in that kind of post-truth way, it must be true. You know, we're critiquing it. And the way we critique it is, you know, our own subjectivity. It is in part by doing that self as instrument work, you know, with us and with others. And then we can kind of bring that into, into the world that we're in. So
Yeah, and when you
yeah,
are in that high stress situation, and you've got a leadership team that are often, what's that phrase? More often certain than they are right. Uh,
yeah,
it can be quite, when you are that kind of, you become often like a lightning rod, because people are sort of pushing back, because maybe you're pointing things out that maybe they're uncomfortable about, or maybe they're taking a different path, or maybe there's another way. It is about being able to sort of hold that space open so people can talk and think a
yeah.
little.
Yeah, absolutely, and hear themselves, and that whole idea of holding the mirror up, and do that in a way that your own stuff and your own needs aren't foregrounded. You could actually, so you're, in a sense, you're on their agenda rather than on your own agenda. And of course, these kind of micro skills, they don't just belong to OD, they belong to coaching or all sorts of, teaching, all sorts of other professions, social work,
Yeah.
and in a sense, those same principles apply. But I mean, I think the other piece in what you're saying there is that more often certain than right. Certainty is comfortable, and in that BANI world we've been talking about, we said the A is for anxious, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. I mean, it's a world
It's
that,
quite a stew, isn't it?
it is. It's a hell of a stew. It's designed to trigger us, into our patterns, into our reactive patterns, which ultimately are about safety. They're about psychological and, in some cases, actual, physical safety for us. Those patterns, and so when people are in that place, that anxious place, you go to certainty because it's safe, and actually, because people won't thank you, those around you, for not being certain. So there's this huge sort of psychological pressure, internally and externally, to be certain. So actually to then go, well, hang on a minute, how do I know I'm right? In a world where there isn't a right answer, it's not just about, well, I've got to go onto Google and find out more. You're in this sort of wicked problem inquiring world where it's about taking perspectives and coming up with some sort of sense making, and actually, the rightness of it depends on people's feelings and points of view about something as much as about objective fact. That's the world we're in. A bit of a space for that.
But it's fascinating, isn't it? And one of the things we're all sort of saying, that the world would benefit if everyone had a little bit of an OD mindset. So is this kind of thinking would be useful for HR directors and HR managers that might be sort of trying to sort of initiate and create change in their organizations as well?
Yeah, I mean that would be my view. So I mean, I think these are universal ideas around what it is to be a human being and live in human systems. But I guess the domain we're talking about them in today is organizations, and the field of practice we're talking about it in is OD. But actually, like we were alluding to a few moments ago, it's no less applicable to leadership or HR or those kinds of skills in organizational life. It doesn't have to belong to OD, and it's no less applicable to parenthood, as we were saying, or any of these, because they're sort of human things. So we're taking some specific ideas, and I mean, we do sometimes say to ourselves, we started in this world of OD, we in Mayvin, but actually, in some ways, that's just the place that we're doing what we're doing in. It's the place that we love. It's the field of practice and the profession we're in. But actually, why not apply it in other contexts? I suppose that's the big idea. And I think the other thing I was going just to say, these things are so often paradoxical, because on the one hand, we're leaders who are supposed to be leading, and know what we're doing, and yet, if we model that to our people, we basically send out the signal that you should know what you're doing, and that people who don't know what they're doing, even in this environment, that's that's not okay. And of course, in doing that, we hugely increase the chances of being certain rather than right,
Yeah.
and yet, if we're totally open about that, that's psychologically very uncontaining for people. Anxious making, that is the double bind in which we find ourselves, and it's very acute, and there are very comparable double binds that people find themselves in all sorts of other kind of walks of life and environments, and so I suppose there's something for me about how as OD people do we put the paradoxical, slightly crazy nature of that reality on the table in a way that it's talk aboutable.
And that's almost one of the eternal challenges, isn't it? Is to create space. You almost have to enter their world, like you sort of said earlier, which is like almost initially dress the language up in a way that is maybe modernist or more sort of certain, and then just introduce a little bit of uncertainty in and build that up as well. I know that this session is going to be really useful for any OD practitioners that are looking to reflect on their practice. I'm already thinking about my own practice in relation to this and some of the situations I see my clients dealing with, and the trade-offs that they're having to make, and the not knowing as well, which has been really useful. So the session is going to be running on June the 27th. It's between 12 o'clock and 1:15. Tickets are free, and you can find tickets on the CIPD London Eventbrite page. We're really looking forward to seeing you there. You'll also have a chance to network with fellow OD practitioners. And on behalf of CIPD London, Martin, I'd like to say a huge thank you for just sharing just a brief amount of insight, which is, I know people find it really useful, and we're really looking forward to seeing you there. So thank you, Martin.
Such a pleasure. Yeah, looking forward to it.